A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
We're joined here today with Matti Karhulati, who's a senior researcher at the University of Ivascalia, working at the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies. He's written a book about the esports phenomenology that's out on Bluesberry, and currently works mainly on health and psychological questions related to esports and gaming in general. Welcome to the show, Matti.
Thanks for inviting me. Very happy to be here.
Matti, I want to start because we're going to talk about fairness and cheating, but I want to start actually by asking you, in what ways do you think esports is kind of its own unique phenomenon, right? Let's say different than traditional gaming or different than sports itself?
Yeah, I think there's two things if we compare esports to sports that make it a little bit different. The first thing is if we look at the big macro structures like how esports are operated, all of the esports are owned by the so-called executive owner. So there's always a big company behind each esport, and they have more or less full control over the entire sport. And the other thing is, if we look at the players and professional players, there's kind of the professional scene where we talk about competitions that happen in local area networks, like LAN parties and tournaments that are in physical spaces, big stadiums. And then we have kind of the online virtual spaces where we have public servers and people playing ranked games over there. So there's kind of two different worlds of esports play. And I think these two things are kind of the key for identifying esports.
Cool. Can we talk about an example? Can you give us a kind of, here's one game where the company that controls it does this, and here's another game where the company that controls it does that, and there's a question about whether one of these or both of these are fair?
Start from a kind of a person perspective. So for an individual player, the company sets rules and you have to follow the rules if you want to stay as a player in the game. There was a recent example, for instance, in Counter-Strike. We have a Finnish player, Jampi, who is a Counter-Strike player, and I think he got one of his accounts banned for cheating some years ago. I'm not sure if that really was the case, but the kind of outcome was that his account was banned, and the company has a rule that you can play in major tournaments if you have an account ban like that. So basically, the player was not allowed to be a professional because of this decision that didn't really go through any court or any kind of open investigation, but the company just decided that because of this instance, you can't be a professional player, and he sued Valve for this decision, but things didn't really go well for him, so he switched to a different game owned by a different company. And I think these are kind of typical cases that happen all the time in esports because the companies make the rules and the players must just simply follow the rules.
So, is this one sort of issue? Because it seems to me like usually you would have some sort of a kind of general authority that would take cases like this and judge them to see if the company acted in some sort of arbitrary way, if this was fair. Is this one of the kind of key issues here that can companies essentially that run esports act arbitrarily with no repercussions?
Yeah, they can, and I think that's a huge problem currently. That nobody's watching the watchers. They can make a decision, and nobody has the right to appeal, more or less, unless you're breaking some local laws or something like that.
But let me ask and see, because I feel like for example, FIFA. If somebody gets red carded from FIFA and gets banned for some for a game or two or whatever the resulting is for getting a red card ban, that's done on the field and there's no recourse to that as far as I understand, right?
Yeah,
I mean that's a referee just making a decision And and again, there are lots of problems with that, right? I mean, FIFA is constantly under scrutiny because of some referee who goes off the rails and does something, but that's their rules. Is the referees make the decisions, and that's it.
But the thing is, in football, you would still be able to, or soccer, depending on where you come from,
Right.
you can still switch to a different league. You can switch to a different team. You can become a coach or something like that. In esports, when you get the ban from the company who owns the entire game, you're out of the entire sport. You have to choose. You, as a football player, let's say you would have to become a hockey player, which would be a slightly more difficult.
Right.
So I think that's.
I mean, this is something you've dedicated years of your life to, and arbitrarily. And when I say arbitrarily, I'm assuming that some esports do have some sort of recourse where someone is essentially. The company might have some sort of, special board for the sport that evaluates these things, right? But there's no, let's say, balancing with a players' union, right? Like you would have in other sports.
Yeah, there are no strong players' unions yet, and that would be kind of the future thing for esports that really people have been looking forward to, whether we can have strong player unions to fight these things. And as said, it's sort of a black box when the decision comes from a company in these cases. So it's not like we don't really know what was the evidence for this claim. We don't know if the player was really cheating, or if they did, how did they do that? There's just the decision coming out, and we can read it from webpage.
So more transparency from the companies would make it feel better, right? It would make it feel more fair to see how their process works.
And at least it would open. Well, it's because it's interesting because it opens up the conversation about fairness, right? About whether they acted fairly. And of course, if you're the company, you may not want that conversation opened. Because that opens it to criticism. If no one knows what you actually decided on, no one can call it unfair. They could just say it's not transparent.
Right. And it can also slow down the process quite a lot. So if as a company you see something that is a problem and you want to fix the problem quickly, opening it up to debate, opening it up to some sort of process could mean that you don't get a chance to fix that problem for some time.
So this seems like a really big deal, Matti. So are there any esports where there is movement on this, where there's some movement to do something about the arbitrariness that might come with something like this? And the finality of being banned from, something that you've trained for years. Yeah,
there's been a couple of attempts for player unions, and there are some, I think, for instance, Riot Games, they organized sort of an internal body of representatives to kind of oversee themselves, which is kind of paradoxical. So it doesn't really work that way. But there have been a lot of public criticism towards these kinds of ways to operate in these companies, and to be honest, I don't think we still have very good solutions, but indeed it would be something that kind of takes time to develop, and of course we also have this challenge that these companies are operating globally, so there are different rules and different regulations in Asia, Europe, and the US, and other parts of the world. So having kind of one size fits all list of things to follow wouldn't necessarily work. So we need kind of a lot of work on this topic to really solve it. But yeah.
It seems to me, though, an oversight board that, or a judicial board or something that's, a company like Riot might have still seems like a pretty, first of all, obvious. And second of all, big step where at least, in order to maintain their credibility, right, you got to make a board like, you got to give the board like that teeth. The same thing is happening with Facebook and their oversight board, as they're trying to kind of give an internal oversight board that the rest of the world is supposed to trust.
Right. And it's impossible to trust them if they're not independent.
Right.
And if they're not transparent.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the challenges in this solution is that, of course, the companies are profit-making companies, so they don't really want kind of if they have some crap going on behind the scenes, they don't really want to make it public because it would be bad PR, bad for the kind of company reputation, and you kind of also benefit as a company to hide all these things behind the scenes, and then you just kind of roll it over with whatever solution you come up with. So
Okay.
that's kind of the conflict of interest with the companies.
Okay, so we got one thing, right? So what's another thing where esport is kind of really unique when it comes to cheating and fairness?
I guess one thing really unique, if we look at the professional scene and the games that are being played, they have a thing called changing meta. So a meta game is something that all sports have to some degree. There are strategies that are very efficient, strategies that are less efficient, and at some time some strategies are used more than others, and generally the teams and players are very well aware of them. But because these games are owned by the companies who really want people to remain as players for a long time, they have to keep changing these games to keep them interesting for players who kind of are the customers. This also leads to a situation where what is efficient changes really, really fast. So in some games, it can be like every 2 weeks, you actually have a new game, or if not a new game, at least very radically different game. And this can be very unfair, or at least questionable to some teams who, for instance, make a very huge investment on a player who is very skilled in certain type of play. And then suddenly the company decides to change the game so that this type of play is no more beneficial, and a company who just invested millions on a player actually have to just bench the player because it's no more useful. So I think this is a very unique thing to esports.
Wow, that is really interesting, right? That the game could suddenly change in some dramatic way, right? That your skills aren't really matching. But why would you say it's unfair? Right? What about it would be unfair? I mean, it's unfortunate, but I mean, all the competitors have to kind of deal with this, or is this unfair in terms of the way that the people running the league, so the company, are treating the people who are participating in the league?
Yeah, I would say it's unfair for the teams and the players because you don't know how it's going to change the next week. So as a player, if you're investing your skills on a certain thing, as a team, if you're investing all your resources on a certain strategy, and then it's no more beneficial the next month, or it's changing just arbitrarily, that doesn't really kind of support this kind of long-term strategic thinking that is part of many other sports, the way in which you think about your team synergy and the players working together. It brings a lot of randomness to this picture, and randomness in any sport isn't generally fair, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because I mean, even if you say, all right, as a company, we're going to tell you 2 or 3 weeks in advance the changes we're going to make changes once a month to the game to keep the game fresh. We're going to tell you what the next changes are when we make these changes, say. So we know, because we know what we're working towards. We know what we're building towards. So everybody would know, but it would still only be, it would just change the time frame, right? It would only make it like you could only plan for a month as opposed to planning for a week. Does that make it better, or is that just sort of kick the can down the road?
That doesn't seem to touch anything that involves really, everything takes, you're developing your skills over a very long time, right? So you would think that a month would not be very meaningful. But let me just get this clear. So when they're updating the game itself, right? So now they're not thinking about the esports people. They're thinking about, my son wants to go and play Fortnite, and Fortnite is going to change the game every so often to make it interesting for people like my son. And then esport players also happen to be competing in Fortnite, right? And they're having a kind of, and if I was the company, I would be primarily thinking of the regular players. So, I mean, Matti, does it seem to you that is this as simple as just picking picking a particular form of the game and using the and having the esport league work on that particular version? Would that be as simple as that, or?
Yeah, I think these days companies are very very well aware of these implications on both kind of the amateur casual side of players and then on the other hand that the professional team. So they try to be really careful on how they balance the game and not make for instance when world championships are going on whichever game, I think the companies are kind of committed to not make major changes anymore like a month before the game or something like that.
Or worse, during the championships. How terrible would that be, right?
So like the whole World Champs tournament would be played with the same patch, so there will be no changes during the games. But before, these things had been quite radically, quite radical in terms. Like as an anecdote, there was a case back in like some years back when League of Legends was not as professional as it is today. There was a champion, which is one of the playable characters in the game called Gangplank, and they also had the story going on in the game at the same time with the professional scene. So there was kind of a lore that they were kind of opening on the website and kind of as a entertainment for the players. And in the story, the Gangplank died for a couple of days for the players, like fictionally. But because of this instance, they decided to, as a joke, remove the champion from the whole game for 2 days. And it was at those times when some players were playing kind of a finals in the I don't remember if it was a challenger series or something where people were basically competing for the last spots in the big tournaments. And some people who had invested thousands of hours on becoming good Gangplank players, they didn't have this character anymore to play because the story team decided to kill that one off. So things like this used to happen more often, but nowadays the companies are more kind of sensitive to these things.
It's really interesting. That's definitely something that I think is really unique, as far as I know, to esports.
And this is something I think that it comes about just because it's so new, right? It's so we're in that sort of Wild West. Nobody really knows how to, and it shows that we're as an industry we're figuring this out. And we're starting to realize, oh, right, there's some things we need to think about, things that we weren't thinking about before, that are now on people's lists to think about every time they need to make a change to the game.
But not just
or
that,
want
right?
to make a change.
The idea of what the game is, right, and the assumption that we're all competing in the game, right? But if I go out to to the playground and I jump into a 5-on-5 game of basketball. The rules may or may not be similar to the NBA, right? Playground rules are playground rules. NBA has these formal, strict rules that will not change, that everyone's aware of. And you have the separation, right, between casual gaming and it's really interesting that here there's something really cool about not having that you're playing the exact same game, right, as the professionals, as a casual player. But then you get these additional kind of challenges of trying to appease both pros and casual players.
Right. I wonder if there will be a time where one of these esports companies decides to basically just spur off they're like, this is perfect. This game as it is right now is perfect for competitive play. We're going to just branch that off, and we're going to keep that. We're going to keep it running exactly this way. We'll let the commercial portion of the game continue to evolve.
Do you see that happening, Matti? Because I kind of don't.
No, I don't think so. I think it's part of the appeal of the game that firstly, like, the casuals play exactly the same game, so it's kind of, you feel that you're in the same space with the professionals, and you can kind of empathize with their actions in the game and outside of the game. And at the same time, I think actually there are some attempts now. I might be wrong, but if it's Apex that is doing it right now, but they're trying to build separate kind of a professional and a casual game mode, so to say. I don't know if it's gonna work because again, like it's also when it comes to the experience of that professional player, they also like to see change. Like if you're playing 16 hours a day, you really get bored at some point. So it's like if you want to maintain that pace, you really enjoy the little changes that come up.
So everybody wants the change, but too much change too fast is unfair to those people who have committed so much, invested so much in preparing for the game as it is. Wow, that is a tough thing to balance.
Right. And I'm still on the fence about whether or not it's unfair for those people. Certainly it's a bummer, right? If the game changes out from under them when they're planning for it to be a certain way. But I'm still not convinced that that's a question of fairness.
Yeah, and I agree, though it's interesting if like for me to think it's more unfair would be like because they all know it works this way. It seems like this is just kind of part of the way things are, as opposed to changes suddenly coming out of nowhere and no one expecting changes ever to come.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be kind of more unfair.
You could probably say that like the team that manages to build a roster that has those players who are capable of adapting, I think that would be an argument for kind of this fairness of the system, that you need to build a team that is capable of constant adaptations. But at the same time, then instances like, well, somebody was just very good at doing some little thing and then suddenly this little thing becomes kind of the hottest thing, the most efficient win strategy of all, and suddenly somebody who had no skills whatsoever in the current dominant meta becomes highly efficient just because of this kind of lottery that was just hitting the right place. That doesn't feel like fair to the extreme. One thing that I like to or do you guys want to?
No, go for it.
It's interesting, right? It's interesting if it really is just the game is changing by chance, right? There's a certain randomness to it, and you need to evolve in your team the flexibility to deal with randomness versus the company controlling the game, changing in a particular way that might be unfair, right? Again, notice, right, that there's something maybe about this, that there might be a difference between simply changing the game and changing in a particular way that somehow undermines the efforts that have been taken by players. But I'm really not sure, because I think we would have to get into the weeds with specifics, right, about how exactly things might be changed.
Right. I can imagine. Here's a kind of a specific situation that I can imagine, where a company sees that this one meta strategy is been dominant for too long, and they're looking and they decide to make a change in order to keep this team from the top of the, basically say this team's been at the top of the ranks for too long. The tournament system is getting stale because this team seems to be unbeatable. We should change the game so that team is now beatable.
That's a great example, right? Because notice, from the league's perspective, right, you want that competition to increase interest and revenue for the league. Mm-hmm. But is that really fair to the team that just happens to be good?
Right.
Right? I mean, that's I like it. I like it, Andy. Go ahead, Matty. And then I want to move on to actually like player to player or team to team, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking, isn't that kind of the thing that happens, especially in the US sports leagues, like when the worst team is allowed to take the first rookie and so on and so on. So we have these balancing acts in a lot of sports where those kind of regulating that league consciously give a little bit of a benefit for the lower teams and a little bit of disadvantage for the upper teams. So in that sense, we could say that it's already happening everywhere. But just as a last...
Go ahead. I was going to give an example of exactly that. When in baseball, Major League Baseball has been trying to, has been tweaking the rules on how people are recruited and how money is spent to prevent the Boston Red Sox from just winning every single year.
Right, right. And yeah, and Maddie's right. This happens in a lot of leagues that are essentially trying to make sure that you don't have this persistent dominance. But I'm thinking it's different than like, the game involves, there's in basketball, the 3-point line is, let's say, X feet or meters away. And I've developed a roster of great 3-point shooters, right? And then you suddenly change the rules on me. Right. And my roster is not that good because now it's like it's another meter back and they can't do it. And right.
And if that was targeted at you specifically.
At me specifically, right? For being too good.
Being too good. Right.
Not for having too much money. And it's interesting, right? Not because the problem with place maybe teams like Red Sox or Yankees, right? Maybe they have too much money as opposed to too much skill.
So I interrupted Matty, though, and I'd like to get back to what he was about to say.
Oh, yeah, maybe we're moving to this direction as well, but just related to these big meta changes that in some games happen quite frequently. Thinking of the individual players, it's also a huge kind of a physical and mental stress for the players to kind of force them to learn the new strategies all the time. And it's very time consuming and energy consuming to keep on learning the new kind of changes that happen in the game. And it means basically you have to stay up long night to kind of learn those new abilities and items and equipments that you need to kind of learn to use. And as long as the game keeps changing with such a rapid pace, it's also not healthy, like even physically, mentally, to the players to be forced in this kind of wheel that they're running.
So notice, right, even let's say this is not an issue of fairness, you can still talk about it as an issue of responsibility, right, to taking care of the professional players that have, put so much and, and love so much, this game that you've created, you're hurting them, literally, right? Yeah.
Although I would like to push back a little bit on the idea that these people are forced to do anything at all.
That's the competition, right? I mean, right?
I mean, in order to stay competitive, right? What you're saying is they need to do this in order to stay competitive.
Yeah, we could say that those people who spend that 16 hours per day training, they would do that anyway. So it's a matter of perspective.
And let's talk 16 hours a day. My God. Right.
Yeah, 16 hours a day is too much anyway. People should not be playing any game for 16 hours a day.
Well, but this is kind of interesting. So maybe we could talk about this as a kind of other issue, right? It seems to me that if this is the amount of workout that you need, a practice that you need to compete, right? And you've got a league where if you don't do that, essentially, everybody else will be. Is there anything that's essentially unfair about? And notice I'm using the word unfair, but I don't even know if unfair is right here, right? I mean, essentially what you've got here is competition, and you might say competition just kind of works that way but competition could be destructive in this way. Right. And maybe this isn't exactly an issue of fairness. Maybe this is an issue of, again, thinking about the humanity, the responsibility that a game might have. But it seems like this isn't the kind of thing where you can cap the the kind of practice hours in any way, unless you've got teams and unions.
Right. How could you possibly even enforce that?
Yeah, now, mind you, I mean, there's always a way to enforce it, right? I mean, you have your teams, which are official teams, register somewhere with software that essentially, monitors. There would always be ways of cheating this.
There would always be ways around that, right?
Right, but at least you've got, something. And I'm not saying this necessarily should be done, but the idea of well, I don't know. I mean, look, for some people, being an e-athlete is just a dream come true. And if that means spending 16 hours a day sitting, in front of a computer, or hopefully taking some physical breaks and working out because you still need to be in good physical shape for this, right? Maybe that's their choice and it's worth it. I want to move on because I want to move on to now things that might be unfair between teams or, let's say, between players. So now let's talk about direct competition.
Direct competition between teams, I would say, like, one big thing also in sports is, as we already talked about, is kind of the budget thing. So there's a lot of teams that are they have huge resources and they can buy the best players, and that makes things much easier. But of course, then those other teams with less resources, you could say it's an unfair advantage. But I guess that's also, I don't know if it's unfair. Like if if it happens in all other sports as well, and you can't really control that except with these things that we already mentioned. And
Right. Again, I think we can look at like salary caps. Look at the way non-esports, physical sports handle these things. They put salary caps in place. You can't just buy the best players, right? You can't. There's within you're limited in some ways in how you can spend money. But there are, of course, plenty of other ways where you're not limited, and if any of those give you even the slightest advantage, even the smallest advantage, it makes sense to do that, right?
Yeah, there's been a big discussion in esports regarding the regional restrictions. So players are in many esports regionally locked. So if your nationality is from a certain country, you're allowed to play in that region, but otherwise you would count towards the limit, which depending on the game is.
Why is that?
How does that work?
In a game that's entirely digital and global, is that? I mean, what reason would they have for doing that?
I think we have to go back to the very first things that were mentioned, like the people want the cities and their teams to be somehow local. Basically, a business perspective that they don't want teams that are not somehow local. I don't know if that's the main argument, but it feels like it's a strategy for business. Also, there's a lot of excellent players in Asia, South Korea and China in particular, and I don't know why. Perhaps they're afraid that the whole scene would be dominated by players that are not from their home city. So.
Right. So what they do is they lock people into regions so that other regions can develop their own talent.
Right. Right. The talent development is a big thing, and kind of those subdivisions and leagues where talent is indeed developed. That's kind of the preferred model of creating a healthy infrastructure, according to some people.
So who's making these decisions? Is this an organization of teams that's making the decision, or is this, let's say, Riot is making these decisions?
Yeah, the companies make these decisions just solely by themselves. They have been formed by some of the teams.
So Riot is thinking, we want player development all over the world, and this will help. And Riot is also thinking, we want the teams to be local so they'll have local fans, and that's overall better for us as a business.
Yeah, I think that's the.
I haven't heard anything about the second part of that, but certainly the first part of that is true, where they would look at the rankings and they would look at this and go, all right, these handful of players are just going to stay at the top of the rankings unless we allow other players to develop in other regions. It's
interesting to me to think about, if I'm one of these players and I'm, let's say there's 50 players from the Shanghai region, right? That can really kind of make it thrive. And I'm the 51st, but I'm better than, a whole lot of people, down in like Sydney, right? That obviously can also seem like it's unfair that you're excluding me from making use of my talent simply because of where I live in order to make money, right? Now, notice, in order to make money might itself be the wrong way to think about it. Money might be a part of it, but, spreading the love of the game, right, might be another part of it. But, right, you can see how this is in some sense a classic dilemma of figuring out what to do in these kinds of situations where you're not going by strict meritocracy, but you're doing it to do potentially further good, in the world. And
Right.
those that get shafted because their talents don't get to be fully realized, do have a legitimate argument, right, that they're being wronged, even though, again, the policy in general might do some good.
Right, for the larger community.
Yeah.
I think you also mentioned something that I would love Matti to comment on is we haven't really talked about the money. And so, you've mentioned that, some of these leagues might pay $1 million for a player and then have that player not be useful.
Teams,
where is that money
not leagues,
coming from?
Teams.
A team, sorry,
Yeah.
a team. Yes. Where is that money coming from, and how does that play into this?
Yeah, that's the good question. There's been a long discussion, or I guess as long as esport has existed for 10, 20 years, it's always been a bubble to some degree. That people say there's a lot of investment money that actually doesn't really make any revenue. The companies are definitely doing well, but the teams, that's kind of the big question mark that we don't really know how well the teams are doing. Obviously, they have some sponsor money, and the fans are buying merchandise and things like this. But there's definitely, especially in the US, a lot of esports are running by investments, and we don't know how the returns are doing.
Right. Sponsorship would be another good reason to have local
Right.
or regional, competitions too, right? And regional teams, is because that's the market for the product that you're selling, that you're advertising, basically by buying a sponsorship.
Right. Easiest way, right, to get a set of fans is by attaching yourself to like a local, right? Which is interesting because, a part of me kind of wishes that wasn't remotely the case, because here we have the possibility for a global community, that essentially just focuses on talent alone, where, these kind of traditional rivalries and these national boundaries that divide us can be gone, and all we're focusing is on, the best player in, Kazakhstan, right? That happens to make it. It's interesting. I mean, part of me is really disappointed by that. Another part of me is like, oh yeah, I could see the point.
Right. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from the Olympics, barring professional athletes, except when they, and of course there have been very controversial decisions where they've rescinded that and gone back on that and said, all right, in this case, in this sport, it doesn't make any sense to bar these people just because they're paid athletes in some league.
Okay. Okay. So going back to the money part, right? So one thing that we found with the money is, so questions of transparency of where's the money coming from, right? And we want to focus. We're still trying to focus on the competition as opposed to everything bad everything problematic about esports, right? It would take a few more episodes minimally, right? We could do a whole podcast series on it. But if we're looking for fairness, right? Obviously, the ability to buy players is a big one. Every other league or every other sport, right, does something about that, right? Is this the kind of thing that does this seem like just an easy fix in esports, where also again, if we're talking League of Legends, so Riot essentially enacts some sort of policy. If you're a team, you have to register, you have to be transparent about how much you're paying your players. There's a maximum budget that you're allowed to have. We want to bring in. It's interesting because another thing that happens in traditional leagues is you have a certain number of teams. In esport competitions, I don't think it works that way, right? You don't have do you also have a certain, you have a certain number of qualifying teams that make it into tournaments, right? From regional, right? So it's a different thing altogether. So where in like a traditional league, well, let's say I have 12 teams, I can say, okay, and the lowest ranked teams will get to spend more money this year or something like that. Can you have something like that? Because that's supposed to make things more fair. Can you have something like that given the structure of esports?
Yeah, so again, have to remind that this so many different esports and
Right,
they're
right,
regulated differently. So, for instance,
right.
Counter-Strike doesn't have this franchise league structure. So they have these major tournaments that are kind of individual events, and they have their own rules. But and also operated, not all the tournaments operated by Valve, but by other independent organizers, whereas Blizzard events and Riot events mostly are by Blizzard and Riot. So when it comes to these franchise leagues that they have, of course, like one of the big things, and again similar to other sports, is that like it's okay to be the last team. It's okay to be the second last team. You don't need to succeed. You're going to be okay anyway because you have your spot, which is highly expensive spot, giving you a lot of sponsorship opportunities and so on. It doesn't necessarily really make sense even to try to win because you're still doing fine. So what's kind of the worth of doing that? And previously, before the franchise kicked in, they had this kind of system where challenger teams could always challenge the last one in the major league, and then you would have the opportunity to kind of jump in. But this is now gone, and that's a very big question, I think. Also from those companies' side, like how can they really encourage the worst teams to perform, and should they do that, or is it just okay to be not necessarily interested in competition that much?
Yeah, are you saying that basically you buy your spot into one of these leagues and that's it?
Yeah, that was basically it. So there was a kind of a certain time when the spots were for sale, and then you have it permanently, and you can't really drop out ever unless you can sell your spot for, like as happened in Europe now, for instance, the Schalke team, they had some financial trouble and they sold their spot. I think they paid 10 million euros for it, and they sold it for 30 million last month or something, for another owner. So the spot remains.
Wow. Right. That's sort of the way the taxi systems in New York work and Los Angeles work. Right. You buy a token and that's yours for your life now.
And no one could get in without buying one of those tokens from you, right? So yeah,
Right.
you have these spots, which is interesting. So your talent is not going to be the issue. The issue is, can your organization come up with the money to buy a spot? Right.
Wow.
Right. I want to kind of go beyond this now too, because I want to ask, besides, let's say, paying for better players, can money buy anything else here? How else can money help essentially one team versus another?
That's a good question. There's been a lot of attempts to buy a lot of things in esports that would and might benefit the team and the players, but it's very, don't really know if these things work. Like there are these boot camps where you move your team to, for instance, South Korea or China to train. They have one of the things we haven't talked yet, but is relevant, is because the players are training against other professional teams, as well as kind of on their own spare time in the evening playing the ranked server. China and Korea have a lot of good teams, so a lot of European and American teams fly to China and Korea because of the technological restriction of the ping. So it's just too much delay basically for Chinese and let's say American teams to play together with the distance. So you have to physically fly to another location to train. So I guess those teams that have the resources can have more of this, but I'm not sure if there's any kind of evidence that this is highly beneficial. It's a lot of physical stress and mental stress for the players to travel such long distances, get used to the new environment and things like this. So it comes also with a cost. Also equipment and kind of psychologists and dietary experts, all these things. Of course, the best teams have all these things, but it's unclear how much they really work.
Right.
Though you would think they would make you would think they would make a difference. I mean, playing against better players as practice. I mean, that itself just seems like a really big deal, right? But how it balances out, I'm sure it's hard to pick out exactly how beneficial any of these practices are. Which is interesting, by the way, when we're talking about not localization, but right restricting people by location. I was thinking at the time, right, that the ping, is it the ping rate? Is that how you would call it? Right, would be another kind of aspect to that, right? That if I'm in Shanghai and I'm competing in Berlin, right, I'm going to have lag where more local players, right, are going to be faster.
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of key issues in esports in general, which goes kind of beyond beyond the competing teams, because the biggest tournaments are always in a local areas. So you wouldn't ever have the issue of ping when it comes to the professional tournaments. But on an individual player's kind of perspective, where let's say Australians have always had this challenge that because the location, not all the companies provide them really good servers. Yeah, so they basically have been excluded from a lot of scenes for a long time. Also, many countries just who are not close to these major servers, they really suffer. Like they don't technically even have a chance to compete seriously because they are living too far from the servers to have a decent ping to play servers.
Now, isn't it true that a lot of these, especially the big money tournaments, they bring the players all together into a single place? So to basically get rid of they also provide them all with the same hardware to play on, right? So that's another way that like the tournaments themselves are trying to prevent cheating through having better hardware, having better ping rates, all these things.
Something that is again like very unique to esports is boosting. Basically means that you have a friend play your account, and your friend who is a highly skilled player will basically increase your rank, and you're just watching from the side. It's quite a huge business in a lot of places. So you can just Google boosting services for esports, and the companies also. And this is very interesting to me because I try to figure out this a lot. Like, why do the companies allow this? Like, don't they have a legal kind of hand that can go and take them down? But they apparently just don't want to take them down because it's a good business as well.
It seems like it would be very, very hard to enforce. How do I know?
Right. They have the tools to detect, so they can see who is playing your account based on the IP address and things like this. So that wouldn't be a technical problem for them, but it's more like, why would we put so much money and resources on killing something that is actually bringing us more money? The more players and the more services the players are provided, the better. But that's something very specific to esports where.
Right. So So how's that bringing the money? I'm curious.
Well, there's whenever you are, for instance, selling accounts, you have to create a new account. If you want to cap that account, let's say, into a very highly ranked account that you will, for instance, sell to somebody, you will actually have to play hundreds of hours, maybe 1,000 hours, maybe use some money to boost your experience, speed up your experience gain, things like this. So in the long term, when these services are huge business, it's a little stream of extra money for the company. So why would they actually pay money to take this down? Because it's not harming the professional scene in any way.
It's interesting, right? The boosting part, because you're looking to boost in the ranks, right? So to have, let's say, a better character, right? I mean, we can go back to, selling characters on WoW, right? And all that. But what's the point of me getting a better ranked character, right? I'm higher in the rankings. What do I get for that in terms of the esport competition? Because, I mean, if I don't have the skill to do that, I mean, how can I acquire the skill without going actually up in the rankings?
I guess there's two things. Like, one is just, of course, to show up. Like, you wanna show your friends, and you also like to gain access to like what it feels to play in a really high ranked tier. the only way you can access that is to actually have an account that is such high. So people just want to have their experience. But the other thing is that not all these boosting services take 100% of care of the journey, but you can actually hire somebody who plays with you. So you are playing together with somebody who is really kind of above the account level, which gives you a really easy way up, regardless of your own skill.
Right. And I suspect sponsorships might make it valuable too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right. One thing we haven't talked about yet is drugs or any kind of enhancer. How do these fit into esports?
Yeah, I think this is kind of the biggest challenge, or like the biggest, the most serious, let's say, this most serious topic in terms of fairness and cheating in esports. It's a big thing that nobody really hasn't got a grip on yet how to deal with it. So technically, esports could just work with WADA or something and come up with a doping program where certain things are not allowed and players would be tested like other sports people. But then again, like esports is such a relatively new thing that isn't really on the Olympics train yet. So there's a lot of challenges related to having such systematic testing and things like this. People don't really know what it really means and what it would also mean for the contracts of players who are having a contract with the profit-making companies. And I bet there are a lot of kind of these PR things again involved. The second thing is that do they really wanna do that? Because like to some degree we were always like, there's a paper by Florence Chi and I, we wrote some years ago, and we were speculating with the idea that why did esports go into the esports direction? Like you could also say it's a performance. It's like a entertainment performance, and then you kind of wouldn't be in the same class as sports. Like it wouldn't necessarily be following the same kind of ethics as these competition ethics do, but you would just be an entertainer as a player, and in this case you wouldn't have to worry about the doping part that much. But of course, how things went, we can't really go for that option anymore.
Well, that's interesting because there are other games now rising in popularity, and we're seeing games like role-playing games where it's not competitive, it's cooperative, and become very popular things to watch on YouTube and on Twitch, and these could be what you're talking about, where it's more about entertainment performances, right? And they dress up in costumes, and that's more, I think, what you're sort of getting at. That like we could have gone that way, it just we happened to go in this other direction with the super competitive gaming. But I think it might actually be doing both right now. We might actually be seeing both of these things happen.
We don't have, when we think about sports, I mean, we don't have cooperative sports, right? When we have cooperation, we call it a performance.
Right. I mean, when we have sporting events that are sort of done for entertainment, I mean, all sporting events are put on for entertainment, right? But then you think about the ones that are like really meant that way. You think about Harlem Globetrotters, or where it is the sport, but it's also not really the sport, or wrestling, where it is the sport, but it's also kind of very performative.
Right, I would say both. Neither one of those are sports. Or the Harlem Globetrotters is not a basketball team.
Harlem Globetrotters are very much playing basketball.
Right, but they're entertainers that do it. While
they're just not
playing basketball.
Really being competitive, right? They're just not presenting themselves as a competitive thing.
Right, and wrestlers are not there to focus on wrestling. They're there to entertain. Where if you have if you got a professional basketball game, they're here to test their mettle, right? They're there to compete, and we're here to watch, right? The entertainment is them competing, and that seems to be a pretty clear priority there.
We tend to think about that, right? We tend to think that if it's not fully competitive, it's not really a sport.
That's kind of interesting, just in its own way, right? Of where does a game become a sport and all that. but I still want to keep us on track with the with the fairness for esports, because again, there's so many things we could ask about esports in general. I still want to go back to the drugs themselves, because I feel like we haven't talked about what is the concern, right? So, when it comes to doping, it seems that your traditional concern is essentially twofold. Number one, the fairness issue, and which is if I'm if I'm getting an unfair advantage by using some sort of enhancer, and the idea there is the enhancer is inappropriate because it's, and then you got your rationale, right? Maybe because it's against the rules, but of course, why those rules? Maybe because it's not natural, and this is supposed to be a natural competition. Maybe for whatever, or maybe because it's going to lead to harm, right? And we're trying to protect all the competitors from runaway competition, and this restricts it to a way where we could all do it without essentially getting hurt. How do people see the drug and any kind of enhancement and fairness in esports? Is it like this traditional perspective, or is it somewhat different?
Yeah, that's a good question, because again, like the companies make their own rules, and some of the companies do have clear rules that I'm not sure if they actually have a list of things that you're not supposed to take, but I'm sure they might have some guidelines that implicitly say that don't take Ritalin when you're playing things like this. So in this sense, like if you're using stuff like that, then you would be playing unfairly against the rules. But in many scenarios, these are not the rules. So a lot of tournaments and companies don't have such restrictions. So then you would only be kind of on the health side of things, that it would be unethical to encourage young players to use stuff that improve their performance with the hope of reaching some big prize money, things like this. So it's a tough question, and I guess it ultimately goes always kind of down to the health things. There's an excellent one frame comic by this XK CD. I'm not sure if you know that, regarding kind of the survival bias, and it's like this person on a podium with a lot of money on around them, and saying that just keep believing in yourself and buy lottery tickets, buy more lottery tickets, and you will make it. I'm a living proof of it. So it's like the belief that these companies, like in terms of like ethics of running an esports company, and I don't know if it's actually the responsibility of the companies or if it's a bigger thing that we need to tackle. But the idea that the young people who see these rock stars playing whatever esports it is, becoming millionaires and kind of building these iconic images of just keep training 16 hours a day and just eat whatever doping you might be allowed to, and you will make it one day. It's not necessarily what we want young people to kind of see. So that's, I guess, very closely tied to this doping issue.
Yeah, very much so.
So in this case, so it seems that to me then that the general idea is pretty much the same as in traditional sports, even though the drugs themselves might be different, right? So I mean, focus enhancing drugs can do so much for your play, right? But you've got these kind of concerns of what it's going to do to the league in the long run, what it's going to do to its image, what it's going to do to its fans, what it's going to do to the players. Right. And, that can be said for any kind of other enhancers in any other kind of sports.
Right.
And there's also the physical thing, which is kind of interesting. Like if you have any traditional physical sport, you probably can only practice, let's say, 2 or 4 hours a day. That's pretty much the maximum for anyone. Right. If let's say you're running, you can't really run more than 4 hours a day. Depending on what you do, it might be beneficial to just do like 1 hour or 2 hours a day or something like that. And of course, you can do all kinds of kind of exercises and stretching and things like this, but that's pretty much the maximum you can put. There's the kind of a organic cap for what you can do in order to be the best you can. But in esports, because the physical element is so different, it's all about this accuracy and kind of focus and things like this. You can actually do that 16 hours, and you need to do that to some degree. Of course, there are a lot of good players who are doing much less, like we have some evidence of teams doing 4 to 6 hours per day, and they're still doing very well. But considering that a lot of top players do that 16 hours, that's something kind of specific to esports and also some similar sports that kind of allow that extreme practice from day to day without getting yourself necessarily hurt. Of course, again, like we have these wrist problems and back problems and things like this.
And how do you do that without Adderall? Is, continually, right? I mean, is kind of the question. If you set the level of competition, it's interesting that this is a problem that the limits of the physical body mostly, well, plus drug testing, take care of in regular sports.
But don't you feel like our physical limits are just, we know them better. Our psychological and our mental limits are just not as well understood. And it might be the case that 4 to 6 hours is all you can really do in this kind of thing too. But we just don't know it yet. We just don't have that scientific data to back it up.
Yeah, interesting. And we also have, we have data that shows us that, many people play video games for 12 hours a day with no problem, as far as they're concerned, right? So notice that,
and again,
whatever
no
data means
is
here,
different than gain, right?
Right.
There might be a real cap on how much gain you can get, and then at that point you're just spending time, and it might not be actually very, very useful at all.
Though notice, right, all this is a matter of efficiency, right? Not necessarily fairness. Though, to me, it's really interesting kind of, how do you keep things fair while also keeping things safe? Is kind of
and that's the ethical question, right? It's balancing like the moment to moment fairness to the long term health of not only the players but of the industry.
Right. And
your fan base and everything else.
Right. And, once you get into stuff like this, right, but you also get into, of course, the people who, unlike traditional sports, right, the people who have prescriptions for Adderall. Now, most people who have prescriptions for Adderalls, are bullshit, at least in American colleges. Right. But certainly there's people who obviously really need Adderall, and Adderall can help them a whole lot, and other kind of stuff like that. And of course, that itself makes it very hard there's not too many, people that need steroids, right? Right. In this kind of same sense, where with Adderall, it seems that it's very hard to kind of decide what do you do with people who have authentic prescriptions for it. Doesn't this give them an advantage, an unfair advantage, right? How can you deal with that?
Yeah. I was just thinking about traditional sports. Like, isn't it an accident that half of the long distance runners have asthma, so that they can have those medications? So it's I think in the long term we can also see in esports, when we have kind of very clear evidence that these things, Adderall and Ritalin, improve your performance, they keep on getting these recipes, and we can't just unfortunately, it seems like it's impossible to change, as the history has taught us from other sports.
That's interesting, though. You would think that because the AMA example is a great example, all right? So you would think that you could have people from the league that essentially would say, this is suspicious. Why don't we run them through our own medical experts? Of course, that costs money. But, in leagues where you have a lot of money, right, that's not an issue, right? And there's already
there's an issue of medical privacy too, that we're very conscious of who gets to know what our bodies are doing.
Yeah, that's interesting, but you would think that this might be less the case if you're submitting yourself to a competition voluntarily, right? I'm not forcing you to give me, private medical information. But if you want to join my competition, this is one of the criteria that you might need to subject yourself to.
But if this is my career and this is the way that I make a living, isn't that unfair as well?
If the way you're making a living might be unfair to other players, right? Because you might be cheating, right? So yeah, you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we need to balance both of those things. Of course, ideally, in order to even begin your career, you would have had to potentially gone through my medical screening, let's say. So you knew it ahead of time, right? So it's not like, it's very rare for sports to do what Matti told us, these esports professional face, right? This sudden change, right? Mostly you kind of knew what the rules were when you got in.
Yeah, and they're constantly tinkering. I mean, the rule book for American football is like this thick. They're constantly adding and changing and tinkering with the rules, but they're usually tinkering with the rules around the outside, and they're going to do it between the seasons. They're not going to do it in the middle of the season. There's sort of ways of doing it.
Because you're not affecting casual players.
Right.
Are there any specific changes or additions that you haven't mentioned that you think esports really should undergo in order to make it more fair? And I realize to say it is already kind of begging the question because it's them and it's lots of very different leagues. But are there any kind of general things that you think would need to happen to make esports more fair?
Yeah, I might have mentioned this already earlier, but I think like the companies need to have somebody to watch the watchers. We need sort of a third parties that look at the decisions made by the companies when it comes, especially to individual players and also teams. These things need more transparency and also kind of third party assessment. So that would be something that each esport that would be considered a significant player in the field, they would need to have a sort of a party that looks after them. But of course, coming up with that kind of a organ would be already a challenge again. How do these big profit making companies get along and kind of can agree on a party that would be equal for everyone, and what does it do to the business? I don't know if it's possible in practice.
I would think I would think that lots of things like that would be driven by fan demand, or competitor demand.
I always want game designers to be involved in it, but that's me.
All right, Matti, thank you so much for coming on our show. God, there's so much more for us, obviously, to say about esports, and we need to have further episodes to look into this stuff. All right, good podcast, guys. Play nice, everyone.